Hello, hello, how are you? I'm Anthony Balzano, professor of anthropology and sociology here at Sussex County Community College in Newton, New Jersey. And today, what we're going to do is we are going to cover chapter 5 in sorry about that, in The Human Story by Alexandra Brewis and other authors. And chapter 5 deals with earliest hominins. And what are that? What are they? Well, it's the very first fossils that we find that walked on two legs and that were in a direct line to us. They are common ancestors. They are our common ancestors. Okay, we are ancestral to the fossils that we're about to talk about. Now, who they are? If you go to, I think it's on page 124 in our textbook, there's a really neat diagram there to this one here that lists all of the fossils that are discussed in this chapter. Sahelanthropus, Auroran, Ardipithecus cabata, Ardipithecus ramidus, and then about 7 or 8 different kinds. Actually, there are 9 different kinds of Australopithecines. Okay, but one of those Australopithecines we're going to call Kenyanthropus sometimes, okay? And then there are Paranthropus, and Paranthropus are kind of a lot like Australopithecines, but they have much larger teeth and much larger heads, and I'll show you some of our friends that we have here to help me do this today. And then we're going to end this chapter with the first Homo habilis. And now all of these fossils date from around 7 million years ago up to around 2 million years ago. So that's sort of the time frame and deep time that we're going to talk about. Here are some of our friends. Here's an example of Australopithecine. This is Australopithecine afarensis. This is a replica of the famous fossil known as Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lucy for short. Here's an example of a Paranthropus. This is Paranthropus boise. It is from East Africa. Paranthropus boise is from Tanzania and Kenya, and Australopithecus afarensis is from Ethiopia. Okay, and then just to sort of bring us back home, sometimes we want to bring in Homo sapien. And this is us, and we're going to demonstrate a couple of skeletal changes and anatomical changes that all hominins have in common and went through during their evolution. Okay, and so let's get started. So actually, I just started. Okay, if you start on page 124, there are 13 different fossils. We have 6 different Australopithecines, 3 different Paranthropuses, 2 different Ardipithecines, and then Auroran, and then Homo habilis, and then at the end we'll talk something briefly about Homo habilis. Now, all of these fossils are found in Eastern Africa. That is, they're either found in Ethiopia, Kenya, or Tanzania, except for one. That's the one we're going to start with, and that is Sahelanthropus. Sahelanthropus was found in Chad, which is in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And that's the only one that's not in East Africa. We would call that North Central Africa, or the Saharan part of Africa. Now, all of those fossils are on page, if you go to page 127, there's a really cool map that lists all of the fossils that we'll discuss in here. Now, having said that, when I say East Africa, I meant Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, and then the one in Chad. There's actually 3 fossils here that are in the eastern part of what is today the Republic of South Africa. And so if you go all the way down to the bottom of the continent, there are some Australopithecines, and then there are some Paranthropuses that are found in South Africa, and we'll sort that out, and they're nicely shown on page 127. Now, this chapter starts out with one of the early hominins that we don't spend a lot of time on in this chapter, except for in the very beginning, because it's a really amazing fossil that was recently found, and it's called Homo naledi. Now, Homo naledi was found in the Star the Star Cave, okay, near Johannesburg, South Africa. And it was an interesting cave because to get to where the fossils were, you had to go through a tunnel that was only 11 inches high. And so what they did is they recruited paleoanthropologists who were very petite and very slender. I think nearly every one of them were women. They were from all over the world, and they didn't mind doing work in very tight spaces. They were also very good spelunkers. That is, they were very good at exploring caves. And they were trained and certified card-carrying paleoanthropologists. How many people fit that bill? Well, about a dozen in the world. There aren't too many. And so they were employed to go in and do that dig and find Homo naledi. Now, Homo naledi looks a lot like the last fossil in this chapter, which is Homo habilis, except for the fact that it's not as old as Homo habilis. And also, what they find is that those particular fossils look like they were deliberately buried there. So if you could imagine, this was about 500,000 years ago. If you could imagine 500,000 years ago, hominin, our ancestors, would go into this deep into this cave to do deliberate burials of their ancestors that didn't look a lot like us. They had a much smaller brain, but they had the wherewithal to actually do deliberate burials. Okay. Now, we just got done talking about primates in the previous chapter, and one of the things we said was that all the hominins that we're going to talk about here, all of the fossils here, and chimpanzees, all of us have a common ancestor. So at some point, all of our hominin line, which is what we call fossils that walk on two legs and pretty hairless like us, okay, species that are pretty hairless like us and walk perpetually on two legs, those are hominins. And chimpanzees had a common ancestor. At some point we split. And so the chapter talks a little bit about that particular species, which we have no idea what it is. But we know that we can speculate that it's probably around 9 million years old. So if you want to become really famous, go out there and find a 9 million year old hominin fossil or great ape fossil that would be a common ancestor to chimpanzees, bonobos, and all hominins. That would be great. Now, that whole idea of a common ancestor is depicted on page 129. The other thing that's talked about on page 129 is that all of this fossils that we're finding and we're dating are corroborated with genetic research, with what we refer to as the molecular clock, and looking at mutations and looking at the chromosomes of chimpanzees and how much they correspond with the chromosomes of Homo sapiens, we can speculate that those genetic changes took place at about 9 million years ago. And the fossils that we're looking at today, their molecular clocks or genetic clocks, it's the same thing, are very similar. So the fossil record falls in line with when we do genetic research, the time it takes for genes to change, which is measured by what we call the molecular clock. And that whole idea is depicted on page 129. So, take a look at that. So let's go over some of the anatomical changes, which is right in the center, the meat part of this chapter looks at it. So how do we know a fossil walked on two legs? Well, one of the very first things we look at is if we can find the skull, we look at its foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is underneath the skull, it's underneath it, and if it's in the center of the skull, not at the back of the skull, we would say that this individual walked on two legs, because what you need to do is when you get up on two legs, the spine then goes straight down, whereas if you were on all fours, the spine would come more out of the back of the skull like this. So if we look on our human replica here, look at the foramen magnum underneath, there it is. It's underneath the skull. So any skull we find, the first thing we're going to do is turn it over and we want to see where's the foramen magnum, and that is one of the key indicators that this individual, in fact, walked on two legs. The other thing that happens when we get up and we're bipedals, we're going to look at the spine. And the spine on quadrupedal animals like chimpanzees and gorillas and bonobos is in rainbow shape. It's like this. I don't have a good spine to show you, but in humans, it's not. In humans, it's more S-shaped. So our spines are S-shaped. Now, if you go to page 132, all of these things are depicted on page 132. The other thing that's really different in bipedal animals is the pelvis. And the pelvis becomes very short. Now, here's a chimpanzee pelvis. Here, let me, upside down. Imagine it's, there we go, like that, okay? It's upside down, and here's and the two legs would come out here, and then the spinal cord would go up over here. You can see it's pretty broad, okay? And what we call the birth canal is pretty big, okay, for what is a relatively small-brained creature relative to us. But if we look at a human pelvis, it's very short, okay? So the pelvis becomes shortened because what happens now is the body is carried, has to sit right on the top over here and carry all the weight. And what happens to the birth canal is it becomes very constricted for a relatively large-brained individual, okay, which makes birth much more problematic for bipeds, for hominins, than it is for great apes. So the pelvis really changes shape also. The other thing that happens in bipeds, eventually what happens is the legs become longer than the arms, but not at first. All of the Australopithecines that we're going to talk about, except for Australopithecus gauri, have longer arms than legs. Ardipithecus has longer arms than legs, but when we get up to Australopithecus gauri and then all Homo, our legs are longer than our arms, okay? And all the fossils in the next chapter, etc., longer legs than arms. It shows how important bipedality and movement becomes to our survival, okay? Those long legs allow us to move faster, move quicker, etc., okay? And the other thing that happens when we get those longer legs is we start to get what we call a double arched foot. Now, it may be hard to see here, but you can kind of see here how this foot, this is a human foot, a replica of a human foot. It's arched this way, okay? This way it's arched, and then it's arched this way, okay? So if you look at your foot, you know that you have that arch in your foot this way, but your foot is also arched like this. You can see how that is sort of, these toe bones, these foot bones, these are foot bones here, are a little bit higher up than the foot bones over here. And having this double arched foot is probably one of the most sophisticated parts of our anatomy. Be kind to your feet. It allows us to put all of our energy to push off on our big toe or our hallux. And it allows us to put one foot in front of the other without falling down. And it allows us to engage in persistent running and persistent locomotion or persistent walking, okay, in a very efficient way, carrying all that weight up on our pelvis, okay. The other thing that happens when we become bipedal, again, not at first, but certainly by the time we're Homo, is our femurs, the upper leg bone, becomes angled in. And that also allows us to give us a gait, G-A-I-T, gait, of putting one foot in front of the other. So at first we didn't walk like we do, okay? The bipeds we're talking about now walked a lot like what you might see if you know like a 2-year-old and how a baby walks when they're just learning how to walk, okay? Probably Australopithecines and Ardipithecines walked like a little bit more like that than we do, okay? It took a while to get there, okay? Now, the other thing that all hominins have is we have a non-honing canine. All right, now we didn't talk much about this yet, but what that means is that we have all hominins, including Lucy. Lucy does not have a big canine, Okay, we lose the big canine. Not totally at first. We kind of see a little bit longer canine than some Ardipithecines, but not very big. But by the time we get to Australopithecines, all those big canines are gone, and all hominins have not a big canine like, let's say, you would find in a chimpanzee or in a gorilla. Okay. Now, what also happens during this process of these fossils is starting again with like probably Australopithecus gauri, which is a little bit later. It's getting close to Homo, and certainly with Homo, we start to see the use of tools and tool making and tool use. Okay. Now the other thing all hominins have in common, probably related to tool use, is an ever-expanding brain. And so with Sahelanthropus, which was 7 million years ago, the brain is just about the same size as a chimp. By the time we get to Australopithecine, it's about 100 cc's bigger. And so if Sahelanthropus is 350 cc's, that's cubic centimeters, that's how we measure brains, which is the same size as a chimp. By the time we get to Australopithecines, it's about 450 cc's. And then by the time we get to Homo, it's 550 cc's. In the next chapter, when we get to Homo erectus, it just goes up to like 750, nearly 1,000 cc's. And our brain is approximately 12 to 1,400 cc's. Okay, so all hominins, what they have in common is they have brain size that is relatively bigger than all other mammals and all other primates. And as we went from 7 million years to 2 million years to 200,000 years, our brains got bigger, okay? So by 200,000 years ago, our brains were the same size, and they've remained that same size, okay? But brain size is not as significant as you might think. It's not so much the brain size, it's how the brain is wired, okay, in terms of white matter and gray matter. Okay, so Homo sapiens have a lot more white matter, which is the inner wiring that connects all the different sections of the brain, which is called gray matter. Whew. All right, that's all good stuff. Okay, now your book sort of emphasizes that hominins first evolved in the Pleistocene, and they actually talk about the border between the Pliocene, which is when we see some of the first apes, to the Pleistocene. But most of the evolution here took place in the Pleistocene. We could talk about the lower Pleistocene, the middle Pleistocene, and the upper Pleistocene. In this chapter, we're well within the lower Pleistocene. And now the apes that we talked about in the previous chapter were in the late Miocene, early Pliocene. I'm not going to go crazy on any of the exams about these ears, but you should just know that Miocene was the age of the apes, Pleistocene was the age of the hominins, and in the middle was the Pliocene, which is more of a transition period. Okay, even though this chapter is set up like that, bring you through chronologically through one and the other. If you go to starting on page 336, they start to go through the chronology of the fossils. I think especially what you might want to know is that the very first Australopithecine was Anamensis, Australopithecus anamensis, and that was about 4.5 million years old. The other super important fossils were Ardipithecines, especially Ardipithecus ramidus. They have a really great depiction. It was nearly a full skeleton, and it dates to around 5.2 million years. What's real important here, and it's kind of embedded in the descriptions, is that nearly all of these fossils were found in places where they lived in wooded environments. Now, how would they know if it lived in a wooden environment. It depends on the kind of carbon that got fixed in the bones. And so, if carbon gets fixed through photosynthesis in a grassland versus a woodland, it's going to take a different kind of isotopic form. And so they will know that that particular fossil lived more in a grassland versus a woodland. Now, what we know is that most of hominin evolution took place on grasslands. But Ardipithecus, for example, took place on woodlands, and most of the fossils in this chapter took place on woodlands. When we get into the next chapter, it's clear that those fossils, evolution took place on grasslands. And that's going to have big implications for behavior and societies and the kind of social groups they have, the kind of cooperation they need to become a successful species. Because after all, hominins are fairly delectable looking to prey animals, okay? And so we often were picked off, our ancestors were picked off by big game, right? Predators, picked us off and ate us. And that happened quite a bit. So what protected us was our intelligence and our societies and the cooperation that we created, and the solidarity and the emotional feelings that we had for each other to protect each other. And that was an important part of human evolution. Now, the big difference between Australopithecines and Paranthropus was that the Paranthropines were a series of species that ran into a dead end. They were pushed into marginal environments where they largely ate nuts and roots and sinewy things in dry, arid environments. And what they evolved was a much more robust-looking skull, because they needed very, very powerful jaws to crack open bones, to crack open nuts, to eat roots. And there are several of these species that are noted in your book. And they're like that because they evolved in a dry and arid environment. And again, this is Paranthropus boisei, and has what is known as a sagittal ridge up here, because the muscles were so big in the head that they needed a place to anchor those muscles did. And so a ridge on top of the skull occurred. And it created very powerful teeth that was obvious for crushing roots and crushing nuts with, and even cracking open bones, because that's where their nutrition came from. As opposed to another kind of Australopithecine, neck down the same, okay? And this is what we call a gracile Australopithecine, or Ardipithecus afarensis, and it's much more delicately boned. There's no sagittal crest up here. Forget that tape up there. Okay, don't look at that tape. And the teeth are much smaller on eek there. Okay, on a gracile Australopithecine. So Paranthropuses were dead ends. They sort of broke off of the Homo line. We have common ancestry more recently with something like Lucy than we do with any of the robust Australopithecines. Okay. There's one other thing I want to point out. It's real important in this chapter, and that is the site in Tanzania known as Laetoli. And the Laetoli site was important not because we found any bones there. We found different kinds of fossils. These are still fossils. We found footprints that were embedded in hot lava, hot volcanic ash, and it left the perfect footprint. And this shows us a couple of things. And by the way, there's a depiction of that in our book, and it's they took this photograph from the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, and it is on page. Where did that go? I know it's in here. Okay, if you go to page. It's actually on page 140, okay? And it's in figure 5.18b. That is actually a photograph from a artistic representation of what happened at Lake Tolly. That is, it's two individuals, probably a male and a female, so there's still some sexual dimorphism, holding on to each other very closely, protecting each other, walking across the hot volcanic ash, leaving footprints behind that then became fossilized. And that tells us something about their social behavior. It tells us something about sexual dimorphism. It tells us something about the kind of social groups they formed. So, so the Lake Tolly site was a really important site. And so those are our early hominins. And that is the major topic of Chapter 5. Great. Have a good day.